Every time I begin revisiting a series of games for these retrospectives, whatever that series may be, there is always one game that above all the rest, I just can't wait to play. One game that no matter how much I love a series as a whole, that one from memory is my favorite, and I'm so excited to finally revisit it. For example, God of War 3 was that game, Resistance 2 was that game, Killzone 2 was that game, Batman Arkham City was that game, and as I'm sure you've guessed from this analogy, Darksiders 2 is that game. As much as I loved the original Darksiders back in the day, it was nothing compared to the love I had for the sequel. I can still vividly remember seeing the 2011 E3 trailer and how excited I was to not only see that Darksiders was getting a sequel, but they were changing up the Horsemen, which meant we'd at least see 4 games in this series. Though that didn't exactly go to plan. Little did I know they'd be changing up more than just the Horsemen for the sequel though, and once I got my hands on Darksiders 2 in August 2012, I just could not stop playing. A nice juicy open world, new loot and RPG mechanics, a wealth of side missions, a completely different playstyle for combat, and in general there was just so much more content to experience here that every night after school or on the weekend after this game released, I was just playing more and more until I did everything I possibly could. For me, Darksiders 2 has always been criminally underrated and underappreciated, even though critically the game did quite well. But to me, Darksiders 2 was that near perfect game, so close to a 10 that I didn't understand why it didn't get the recognition back in 2012 it deserved. That's why I was so excited to revisit this game today above the rest of the series. But as I always say, nostalgia is a tricky beast, and not only that, but a decade is a long ass time between playthroughs, and my tastes when it comes to gaming have definitely changed since then. So now that I've finished revisiting Darksiders 2, the question is, how does it hold up 10 years later? Is it worth your time revisiting or playing through for the first time? And simply, is Darksiders 2 as good as I remember? Let's find out. Just quickly before we get started, this is now my second video on the Darksiders series so far, so if you've just found the channel, I recommend catching up on this series of retrospectives. Click the link in the top right hand corner or in the description below for the playlist, and what the hell, subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Alright, let's get started. Darksiders 2 is set during War's 100-year imprisonment, so this story isn't a prequel, but more or less runs parallel with Darksiders 1. The 4 horsemen, War, Strife, Fury, and Death, our protagonists for this game, are the last of their kind known as the Nephilim, a cursed fusion of angels and demons who waged war on all of creation. In order to preserve the balance, the 4 horsemen, as they would become, tired of their kind's constant conquest and slaughtered all of their own kin in exchange for incredible abilities and powers from the Charred Council. Death personally slayed the last Nephilim, who ironically was the first Nephilim, Absalom, and this feat earned Death the title of Kinslayer, amongst others. What the Charred Council was not aware of though was that Death secretly preserved the souls of the Nephilim in an amulet, gifting it to the Crowfather, also known as the Keeper of Secrets, for safekeeping. Flash forward some time, and whilst War is being charged for his crimes, Death is certain his brother is innocent and sets out on a personal mission to erase his brother's crime, which means resurrecting humanity, and this is where our game begins. Death travels to the Icy Vale, a dimension that sits between the 3 kingdoms of heaven, hell, and earth, where he meets the Crowfather in search of proof of War's innocence and a way to restore Earth. The Crowfather tells Death that he must go to the Tree of Life in order to restore humanity, but demands that Death take back his amulet. Death refuses, and the Crowfather attacks in the shape of War, which results in Death being forced to kill the Crowfather. This shatters the amulet and sees the fragments embed themselves in Death's chest, knocking him out and sending him into a portal created from the Crowfather's death. We awaken in the Forge Lands, which is populated by the Makers, who are a race known as the Architects of Creation. It's here we learn that their world, along with many others, have been overrun with corruption, a dark force that, inconveniently, has blocked off the Tree of Life and has taken over numerous Makers' constructs. In an effort to combat the corruption, the Makers had begun to craft a massive Guardian, but had to abandon it before finishing the task due to the surrounding threats. With the help of the constructs and a Maker named Khan, Death reaches the Guardian. However, upon its activation, the Guardian is tainted by corruption, forcing it into a rampage. Death battles the behemoth and destroys it, allowing it to reassemble free of corruption, and then go over and self-destruct in the grasp of the creature blocking the Tree of Life, which lets Death reach his goal. Once Death reaches the entrance to the tree though, he is seized by corruption and dragged within. Here Death is approached by the shadowy, corrupted form of Absalom, whose hatred for Death lasted beyond his defeat by Death's hands, and birthed the corruption, enabling him to take his revenge on creation. Death is then transported to the Kingdom of the Dead, where he meets the merchant Ostagoth. It's from Ostagoth where Death learns that he must find the Well of Souls in order to bring back mankind. To find the Well of Souls though, first he needs to speak with the Lord of Bones. To do that, we complete various trials to gain an audience with the Lord of Bones. Death is transported to the City of the Dead to find a soul capable of telling Death what he needs to know and do about the well. Death faces off against a creature that houses all of mankind's souls, and it's from here we meet that soul the Lord had alluded to, the Crowfathers. The Crowfather tells Death that the souls of humanity are no longer bound to a host and have been transported to the well. We also learn that the Well of Souls has the power over life and death, and with it, the spirits of all things living are cleansed and renewed before they're sent off to be reborn. To access the well, Death needs to acquire 2 keys. One is kept by the angels and the other by the demons. Death wonders why the horsemen never knew of the powers of the well, and the Crowfather explains that the council feared if the horsemen had learned about its power, they might try to resurrect the Nephilim. First, Death seeks out the key held by the angels and is sent to an outpost in heaven called Lost Light, which, like every other land and realm, has fallen under an assault by corruption. We reach the Ivory Tower and meet Archon, who tells Death that his answers are in the Ivory Citadel, which is overrun by corruption. Archon sends Death to Earth to bring back the Rod of Araphel, a powerful holy weapon, so that the way to the Citadel can be cleared. On Earth, Death encounters the remnants of the Hellguard led by Uriel, and with their help, Death reassembles the shattered rod. Once we reach the Citadel and confront its custodian, Jamarat the Scribe, Death realizes that the Archon has held the key this whole time and has fallen to corruption as well. So we return to Lost Light, kill the Archon, and acquire the first key. Death then heads over to Shadow's Edge, described as a dark reflection of Lost Light. Upon his arrival, Death sees the world itself is in the process of being devoured by corruption. Death travels to the fortress home of the demon lord Samael, only to find Lilith, the demon queen responsible for the creation of the Nephilim, and is why she refers to herself as Death's mother. Death learns from Lilith that Samael is gone, but he can meet with the Demon Lord through the use of a time portal. Before he can leave though, Death is urged by Lilith to follow his heart and revive the Nephilim once he reaches the Well of Souls. After going through the fortress in both the past and present, we finally meet Samael, who is not willing to just give Death the key. Samael tests Death in battle and after succeeding, gives Death the demon key. Now with both keys in hand, Death returns to the Tree of Life where we meet the Crowfather, who reminds Death that the fate of two races, humanity and the Nephilim, are at stake here, and warns that the corruption has chosen a champion to block Death's efforts. Death uses the keys and proceeds to the Well of Souls where he is met by Absalom. Absalom taunts and mocks Death by saying that corruption does not harm Death because he is already blackened by the sin of betrayal. Death and Absalom face off in battle. Death defeats him, just as he did eons ago, and the Crowfather appears one last time. He explains that Death may tap the well's power to restore one race, but a sacrifice is needed to do so, and choosing one race will forever doom the other. Death, as he said from the get-go, chooses to save war and sacrifices the souls of the Nephilim as well as his own because, well, they're attached to him, and leaps into the well. In an epilogue, we are retold the final moments from the first game, and when the scene of the other horsemen arriving appears, the narrator states that the number of the riders shall forever be 4, alluding to the fact that despite Death's sacrifice, he's just fine. In a post-credit scene, Lilith is seen being berated by a being who is completely in shadow, probably Lucifer, angered that humanity has been restored and the Nephilim are lost forever. Lilith says she awaits punishment with a smile, but the entity states that she will get no pleasure from it this time, and as the screen fades, Lilith is heard screaming in agony. And that's the story for Darksiders 2. In regards to Darksiders 2's story, if I'm honest, I didn't enjoy it as much as the original Darksiders this time around. That's not to say the story is bad. Far from it, in fact, but what I think the original has and the sequel doesn't is the truly engaging characters. Death and his supporting cast this time around, whilst interesting and adding so much lore and much needed backstory with characters like the Crowfather, the various makers and their constructs, the undead souls like the Lord of Bones, or the intrigue surrounding Lilith, for example, but they just don't compare to characters like the Watcher or Volgrim or Samael, who whilst two of these characters are present here, they either sadly get no story presence or just aren't involved enough to be nearly as compelling as before. I do believe Darksiders 2's story is leagues and leagues above the originals in terms of world building, how much more you are able to engage and expand upon conversations through the dialogue wheels, the backstory for the horsemen and the Nephilim. There is an ever-present threat throughout the whole story, and like the original, they give you a plot that leads to vast and unique locales, as well as truly badass encounters and moments in new realms and heaven, hell, and earth alike. I'm not saying this isn't an interesting story, because it had me hooked from the beginning to the end, and even though Death choosing between humanity and the Nephilim is an obvious choice, you still question what Death will choose because he is clearly conflicted the whole journey. But my favorite aspect to Darksiders' story was those characters and how much I was invested in just hearing them all speak, and here in Darksiders 2, they don't have that same charisma. Again, I was truly invested in what these characters were saying this time around because they expand on this world beautifully, but none are nearly as memorable as the top tier characters of the original, and for me, that was a bit of a letdown. But I don't want this to come off as doom and gloom because there is a lot to like here, and I can move past the characters and their interactions with Death this time around because, well, Death isn't war, nor is he in the same situation. Death is trying to save his brother from persecution, and because he isn't automatically the guilty one, his interactions with the absolute wealth of characters we meet on this journey are much more settled. You feel more helpful as opposed to helpless, and whilst you need to help the makers or the dead or the angels to progress further to our goal, it feels like Death is in control. Sure, he gets used by the likes of the Lord of Bones, who has us recruit his various leaders only to kill them shortly after, and Archon, who just straight up fools us, but for the most part, Death is in the driver's seat. This feeling of being helpful means Death's interaction with characters like the Makers are much more pleasant than anything we experienced before, meaning you aren't questioning everyone's intentions, which ultimately leads to some downfalls, but for the most part lets us just absorb what we're being told about this world and its inhabitants. It's a shame with that feeling they don't pair that with some star-studded characters, but I'll leave that alone now. With all my character slander though, I do have to correct the ship slightly and say that I loved Death and his story arc here. He may at times deliver some questionable lines that made me laugh more than anything, but as a whole he has great motivation, the backstory, learning about the Nephilim, and how even though Death essentially dealt the finishing blow to his own kind, he could not let them go. The more this story goes on, you feel this conflict building surrounding the Nephilim's souls, and you know it's going to come down to them or saving his brother. Yes, the answer seems obvious, but that doesn't mean the conflict within isn't felt, and it's touches like that, or how you can see that Absalom taunting him and calling him a betrayer is something that has eaten him up inside. I just found myself really empathizing with Death. He's a smooth talker and a badass horseman, but the conflict and reason for his quest is something I really enjoyed, and in terms of characters, he sits at the top here, no question. In regards to gripes with the story itself, yeah, Death's sacrifice is ultimately made a little pointless. I was hoping once Lilith arrived she'd be a more present character than she ended up being. I was hoping for more of a Samael role here, but she just isn't around for long enough. But other than that, and you know, not as strong a cast of characters, going for more quantity over quality, I had a lot of fun with Darksiders 2's story. In my opinion, it may not be as strong character-wise as the original, which is something that I really loved about Darksiders 1, but everything else is extremely well done. The world building, backstory behind the horsemen, new races and realms to learn about and explore, building upon the original in meaningful ways, and the new dialogue trees, whilst simplistic and maybe not at a Mass Effect level, still helps the player learn more or less about this world if they want. At the end of the day, it's another absolutely badass journey with a much more interesting story, and again, it just supports the gameplay so perfectly, it's hard not to have a good time with. When you think of most sequels in gaming, more often than not, the mindset seems to be, if the original was any good of course, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. That's not the case here in regards to the gameplay for Darksiders 2, and whilst I'm not talking the level of difference like say Jak and Daxter to Jak 2, Vigil still shook up the formula quite a lot here. Was it all for the better? For the most part, I think so. They fixed a lot of the issues I had with the original, but some things, while not bad per se, didn't gel with me as much this time around. Let's get into the meat and potatoes though, because we do have a lot to cover here, and first things first, I want to address the tutorial or opening hours in Darksiders 2. The tutorial aspect and opening hour or so of the original Darksiders was pretty poor when compared to the rest of the game, and I think a big reason as to why that is was because it took a while before Darksiders felt like it had found its rhythm or general formula. The combat was bare bones, no real puzzles or great platforming challenges, it all just kind of felt a bit meh until the first dungeon. That's not the case here in Darksiders 2. This time around it feels like Vigil Games, despite mixing up the formula, knew exactly what they wanted Darksiders 2 to play like, and that's evident right from the get-go. For a tutorial, this trek through the Icy Vale feels so organic as you progressively are showing the ropes to combat, the loot system, changes to platforming, having access to Death's Steed Despair from the jump, and all whilst not shying away from the badass encounters like battling an ice golem or fighting against war. This is all within the first half an hour or so as well, and that's about all the tutorial you'll get in Darksiders Darksiders 2. It's not a massive info dump, but it gives you the basics in an engaging way through the interesting locale and boss fights, and most importantly, it doesn't feel like a separate part of the game. Everything here just gets expanded upon, but the general gameplay is all based on what you learn here. Maybe I'm looking into all of this too much because of how disappointing the original was in this department, but I think they nailed the execution of this tutorial and I was hooked from here onward. Not to say the tutorial is the best aspect of Darksiders 2 or anything, but it feels more natural to go from this into the rest of the game. Okay, with the tutorial out of the way, let's dive into the rest of the game, as always, beginning with combat. Now, if I was to compare combat between Darksiders 1 and 2, I'd have to say it feels like the difference between Dark Souls and Bloodborne. It's not the perfect analogy, but those who have played both probably get the gist. In short, whilst at a glance the combat between the two games may look similar, they feel quite different to play, and a big reason as to why that is the difference in the protagonists. Where War was a much tankier, heavier feeling character, Death is much speedier and, well, feels more deadly, but is built more like a glass cannon. Does a lot of damage and can do it quick to boot, but isn't the most durable, which is represented through the change of the health systems. No more endless health bars here. We've got potions to heal up in combat, but that health bar is singular, and you need to be on your P's and Q's if you want to maintain a good level of health throughout the tougher encounters. Now, I'm going to come back to this point shortly, but I varied off a tad from the actual combat, so let's get back to that. In Darksiders 2, there is no blocking or parrying. You have a dodge and dash, but that's about it when it comes to Death's defense outside of the loot system, which again, I'll go over more in a second. Defense, or lack thereof here in Darksiders 2, is where that analogy comes into play. Speed is your defense. Damage is your defense, and the quicker you can get enemies out of encounters, the better off you'll be, because if you stagnate or linger, you are put in tougher and tougher situations. It doesn't seem like a huge difference, and I'm not acting like dashing and finding openings weren't a thing in the original, but when you completely remove blocking and change so much about the protagonist, the flow to the gameplay changes drastically, and personally, I thought it was a great change. At the combat's core though, the two games are still quite similar, so it doesn't have this immediate disconnect with fans. Combat begins much the same way and expands through purchasing more combinations, and those combos are based more on timing, like a fighting game, given square or X is the only attack button for your scythes. You still have horse combat, a few power-ups are similar, like the grapple hook that is now a hand. Death has, well, a death meter, all that sort of thing is very much the same as before, but the way combat feels is just so different. In regards to the main weapon on offer here, the scythes compared to the Chaos Eater are just so much more like daggers, again, much quicker and deal smaller damage, and they just feel so great to use. They just create a beautiful flow with their attacks and combinations, especially once you start mixing in cyclones and spinning attacks or harder hitting full death mode attacks, and even a lot of the special abilities are quite scythe oriented and visually so damn awesome. They're just a great primary weapon that always feel the most relevant even when you start finding stronger and stronger secondary weapons, which brings me to the loot system. The loot system in Darksiders 2 is one of the best new implementations Vigil Games could have made with this sequel, in my opinion, because it is so combat centric, and that means the combat, no matter if it's your first hour or 20th hour, it's always keeping things fresh, interesting, and filled with variety. 1 minute you may have a slow lumbering hammer as your secondary, which creates a beautiful yin and yang with the scythes, and the next encounter you may have more of a gauntlet that are even quicker than your scythes, but much closer in range. Weapon wise, there isn't a smorgasbord of options. They'll either be an axe, hammer, some type of gauntlet, maybe bladed or something like that, but visually they do have quite a bit of variety, and the stats are the most important thing, which change up drastically from weapon to weapon, armor piece to armor piece. You have status effects like ice and fire, health and wrath regen, higher or lower critical chance and damage, added defense, health, wrath, more resources upon kills, more death meter per kill, the list goes on. This is where that variety comes into play, because it's not just about raw damage. Or maybe it is for you. Maybe you prioritize other sources of damage, need more health and defense for certain fights. Whatever it may be, it's worth having a lot of options available, and that's not a problem you'll run into here in Darksiders 2, because you find stuff constantly. Not everything's a winner, and when that's the case, it's a good thing you have possessed weapons, which take sacrifice loot to level up and make that weapon better. This is a mechanic I'm sure was implemented so that players can keep gear they like for as long as possible, but possessed weapons are really what you're after here in Darksiders 2. They may have a level cap and eventually you do need to move on, but they're just so useful and always get better that makes you excited to pick up loot even if you have no interest in using it. It's just a good sacrifice. Possessed weapons are hard to come by. Most of mine came from exchanging boatman coins and a ton of money to get them from Vulgrim, but they're well worth it, and through that economy help the player want to go out and explore the world more. My only gripe with this system actually isn't about finding the loot itself, but buying. It's sort of pointless unless they're from Vulgrim, or at least that was my experience. They usually don't stay the most useful for long, they're damn expensive for anything good and you can't level them up, so they're just not worth the investment or money that can be better spent at Vulgrim or on different combinations. Other than that though, I think this was a great inclusion that really helps freshen up the combat from one to another and is vital if you want to survive these enemy encounters. Which brings me back to those tougher enemy encounters. Darksiders 2 is a lot more challenging than the original because of its emphasis on attacking being your best defense, paired with Death's smaller health pool, limited number of potions, optimizing your loot to best fit your encounter, or just in general help your survivability and attacking efficiency. And to match this, the enemies themselves leveling up throughout your journey, being able to take a hit more comfortably, and also being or seeming much quicker as well. I died quite a bit in Darksiders 2, which is something I cannot say for the original. This game has some serious challenge to it, and sometimes it's not always great, like potions for instance being at times plentiful and others you won't see one for hours, forcing you to backtrack and buy some. And then you find some and can't pick them up. But generally, it's much more engaging, tense, and satisfying to participate in combat, which is something I love in my video games. It feels good to start and find your rhythm in this game, find your flow between attacks, special abilities, horse combat if able, and perfectly dodge and evade enemies in the process. It's a much more engaging experience combat-wise, and with the frequent changes to your arsenal, it means you're always finding that flow again and repeating that cycle, and it just for me didn't get old. I should also mention they did fix the death or war meter here in combat as well with a special talisman, so no more focusing on just one weapon, which was a great fix, though it does limit me wanting to use other talismans. Really, my only problem with the combat is due to the more open nature of the game and a more frequent reliance on the lock-on feature. It just zooms in too much for the larger arenas, but without it, the camera can lag behind a bit. It's not a huge problem, but something I noticed the longer I played, and I think if you are going to have your lock-on zoom in or focus so aggressively on one enemy, well, don't do that and zoom it out for a better view. Other than that though, this combat is an absolute blast, and that carries over this time to the bosses as well. Okay, so there are a lot of bosses here in Darksiders 2, like supposedly around 36, including mini bosses and side quest encounters, so for my sake, I'm not going to go over every single boss in Darksiders 2. What I will say about the vast majority of these battles though, before I go over what I believe to be the main game bosses, is that again, they're a huge improvement over the original for me. Don't get me wrong, badass wise, I think the original has it, but in terms of the actual battles, and again going back to that challenge, they're just more my sort of speed. For the most part, they're all just tense, engaging battles that will put you in your place quickly if you aren't prepared. Not every fight is like this, but it's definitely more often than not with some battles this time around that actually took me a couple of tries to get right. But let's get into more specifics because the improvement to the bosses is evident right from the battle against War, or the Crowfather dressed as War. Look, this is a tutorial battle, so it's not at the height of challenge, but War is no less a great battle, and he's a great opponent to teach the player the difference in playstyles between the two horsemen. As I mentioned, he's much more tankish than Death, but it helps show the player how to effectively use Death's greatest strength, his speed. Dodging in and out of attacking, utilizing your minimal toolset to the best of your abilities, and before long you'll have learnt the basics and had a badass fight to boot. After this tutorial, in regards to the main fights, you do have a few that sort of blend together due to how similar they are, whether it be Khan or the Construct Hulk in the main game content or the Corrupted Custodian in the side missions for example, are these hulking masses of rock that are a good time to fight, but again, they feel like they repeat with a fresh skin. They have big attacks, do big damage, and it's up to Death to maneuver around and utilize that ever important speed to come out victorious. The appeals to these battles is definitely that feeling of David versus the Goliath, but I do wish they didn't feel so alike is all. Overall, some good battles though for sure, and they need to be taken seriously or you'll be out of potions real quick. The next battle, or battle against something new, is against the giant beetle called Karkanos, who is probably the most gimmicky fight of the game. You mostly wait around for giant boulders to fall and hurl them at this giant insect to stun them, and then attack all you can. It's not a bad fight, and a gimmick isn't a negative. In fact, it stands out here because of how different it is from the rest. Not the most challenging, but an enjoyable fight. Now, spectacle wise, nothing tops the Guardian boss fight because holy hell is this epic. You ride around the massive arena with despair, and whilst I've never played it, it has a very big Shadow of the Colossus vibe. As is often the case with the huge spectacle fights, it isn't the most challenging or complex, but for what it is, it had my eyes glued to the screen, ready to take down this corrupted behemoth. The fight against Nasha is a great time when the damn thing leaves the underground. There is quite a bit of waiting around here in the first phase, but once the skelly worm starts evolving before us, this is good fun because whilst it is similar to the construct fights, its attacks are much quicker and more whip and spinning like that makes dodging and attacking a lot harder. Maybe it's something to do with the design as well, but just good fun and something different while sticking in the same realm as the big lumbering bosses. The battle against Pharisee is like they took the battle against War and then made it not for the tutorial. Pharisee functions much the same, more tankish, but with the bonus now of summoning the undead to distract you, and if you don't keep an eye out, you'll be punished quickly. The human battles are always much more enjoyable because they feel like they match the player's skill set a bit better and test their skill, and that's exactly what Pharisee does. Then we face off against the Bone Keeper, who initially is, well, just wailing on a helpless skelly. How quickly things change. Again, the Bone Keeper turns into more of the same, big lumbering foe that feels good to zip around and deal damage, but you know, I've said it before by this point. Enjoyable fight for sure, but same. The fight against Basilius and Echidna though is an incredible fight that actually killed me a couple of times. The mixture of the pitch black arena, multiple enemies with different things to worry about, it all just makes for a tense and utterly enthralling battle. Basilius is a threat as is, dealing a lot of damage and quick, he dashes everywhere, you can lose him quickly, it all just makes for a battle that keeps you on the edge of your seat, and then with all of this, you have to worry about the enormous spider attacking you too that you have to listen out for whilst avoiding Basilius. One of my favorite fights in the game. Great fun. Then after this, we return to that spectacle mixed with a bit more challenge with the Wailing Host. This Cthulhu-esque behemoth is more visually stimulating than outright difficult, but can definitely deal some damage quick. The bigger the foe, the less combat orientated they usually are though, and that's definitely the case here. Badass boss visually, but I think that carries this fight because it can drag a tad with its massive health bar. Next is Jamara the Scribe, who is another tough fight, a theme going forward, that again took me a couple of tries to get right. He more or less is a stationary target, but does massive damage and quick, so you really need to optimize those abilities, dodges, and attacking often, but retreating when needed to. Jamara is a true test and good fun to boot, but then straight after we battle against the Archon, which whooped my ass a few times. Something about the angels, they just give me a tough time, and Archon is no exception. He has a big health pool, deals big damage, is quick and covers ground quickly, and just puts you on the edge immediately. There are phases in this fight that are more sit and wait, but man, you need it just to recover. Archon is another top tier fight, maybe the best in the game. We're coming to the end now, I promise. The second last battle is against the one, the only, Samael, who isn't as challenging as I'd hoped. He is tough, don't get it twisted, and maybe the Archon fight finally whooped my ass into place playstyle wise, but I just thought he'd be harder for some reason. Nevertheless, Samael is a truly epic fight that fans were waiting to happen in the original, and it is more a test of skill than anything, so I'll give it a good old enjoyable, but not one of the best. Our final fight is against Absalon, who again is definitely challenging and requires your full attention with sweeping big damage attacks, but I just never found myself worried about defeat, though I was pretty kitted out by this point. A super solid fight to round out the main story though, and great fun. I just would have liked it if the Archon or something similar in challenge was the final hurdle, but that's just me. That's just the main bosses in Darksiders 2, without talking about the wealth of others, but look, overall, they all do what bosses should do. Either provide a test of your abilities and show the full potential of the combat, or provide a great set piece and spectacle that couldn't be achieved otherwise. And Darksiders 2 nails both of these criteria and then some. Again, not every single battle is a winner, but more often than not, they're just great fun and frequent injections of badass, which is always welcome in Darksiders. But as always, and especially in regards to Darksiders 2, there is so much more than just the combat here. In fact, the combat at times can feel quite spaced out depending on what you decide to do in this vast world. Now, the original Darksiders did have an open-esque world to explore, but Darksiders 2 took that and said, nah, let's just do an open world. You have a couple of different realms separated by teleporters, but the two main open environments are the Forge Lands and the Kingdom of the Dead, in which you have a decent sized area to explore, ride around and find anything from collectibles, dungeons, side quests and secrets that all make this world feel so great to be in and begs to be explored. There are a couple of drawbacks in this design, one that ties into a larger point I want to make at the end of this segment, but another is in regards to the dungeons. Now, the dungeons are still so tightly designed. They incorporate all the different gameplay elements like puzzles, platforming and combat beautifully. They're a pure joy to explore and progressively figure out and conquer, but with the open world and the massive amount of dungeons means they can feel repetitive. A lot of dungeons do rely on being there, done that mechanics, like riding atop these constructs a bit too much, for example. Some dungeons feel similar to explore to one another due to the locales not really changing all that much, that sort of thing. Again, they're great fun and much like the original are still one of the highlights of the whole gameplay experience, but but they aren't as memorable as, say, the Cathedral or as challenging as the Black Throne. Just in terms of memorability, I don't recall these dungeons as much as the previous game, and I think that's because of how many dungeons there are here. Whilst we're on dungeons, I think it's probably about time I talked about the platforming and puzzles. Platforming wise, mostly it's a great improvement and far more involved in the gameplay loop than before. We now have a wall run and the ability to climb on beams, but we lose the double jump and floating from before, which is a shame for sure, but overall, this simple change and how much more the platforming is involved is a great time. I enjoyed the various platforming challenges and figuring out ways to find secrets around this world, but I do have one issue that annoyed me during the time platforming challenges. Wall running when you wanted to climb up and vice versa. Sometimes Death will sort of do his own thing, and during these intense moments when it happens, it's infuriating. It's not all the time, but it happened enough to a point of annoyance, but mostly it isn't make or break, luckily. Puzzle wise, as I said in the dungeons, the solutions can be the same a bit too often. Some are really engaging, like personally, getting the lanterns to progress involved more platforming and puzzling, which I really enjoyed. Or the portal puzzles in the Citadel are true brain teasers that involve so many different elements, but those boulder constructs do appear too much for my liking. Nevertheless though, puzzles are still great and an engaging break from combat that, whilst at times similar, are still a lot of fun to figure out. Before I dive back into the open world mechanics and that second issue I was talking about though, I do want to take this time to talk about something that, well, I don't often talk about, and that is the incredible soundtrack. Darksiders 2 has one of my favorite soundtracks in gaming. It's just a beautiful complement to the gameplay, and frequently, especially in the Forge lands, gives me that feeling of exploring Middle-earth. It can be very Lord of the Rings-like, which for me is a quick way to my heart. There are a lot of moments in combat and moments of exploration that wouldn't work as well as they do without this stellar OST, and it needs to be appreciated more. Okay, back to that open world now. So here's the thing. This world is incredible. Riding around on Despair and exploring the various tombs, dungeons, finding underwater caverns, side characters, side missions, and those side missions leading to interesting objectives or boss encounters. I loved being in this world and trying to do everything I could, or at least that interested me. Things like the Crucible and those waves and waves of enemies aren't my thing personally, but for the most part I wanted to experience everything this game had to offer. The world is just designed with a great sense of wonder and with a great flow to exploration that I honestly thought, I want to do everything I can in this game. It all just meshed together so damn well between the various gameplay mechanics and improvements and the vast worlds to explore. It was incredible. But then I noticed that difference in my gaming preferences between 2012 and 2022. Open world games can captivate my attention like no other, at least if they're good, but they also lose my attention in an instant. Back in the day, if it was an open world, it was an immediate positive, but now, yeah, not so much. I loved this world and everything I was doing in it, but around the 20 to 25 hour mark, I just lost all interest. That's what I mean by issue, because it's more of a me thing, but I only have a certain amount of time in these games without a main objective where I'm compelled to keep playing, and once that time's up, it's up. It's for this reason that I only checked out one of the DLCs on offer. It was a great dungeon and all of that with a fun boss battle, but I was just done playing Darksiders 2 at this point. I can't emphasize enough that it's not because the game changed at all, or the side content became less interesting. It's just a personal thing I have now where I'll play a 6 to 10 hour experience for hours and hours, but the more open a game is, I just can't keep that same enthusiasm. As much as I love Darksiders 2 and everything it had to offer, I did just hit a brick wall and had to call it because the game is too good for my last memory of the game to be, well, forcing myself to keep playing. So overall, Darksiders 2's gameplay was incredible. The combat feels fast, is constantly putting you at the edge of your seat. The challenge is much improved. The loot system keeps combat fresh with such frequency that it never gets old. The world is a pure joy to explore. The dungeons are at times repetitive, but are still one of the highlights of the whole game. The bosses are a lot more engaging than before. The soundtrack beautifully goes off of the gameplay. It all is just top tier. Yes, I did lose interest eventually, but for 20 or so hours, I loved being in this world and playing this game, and that, for me, shows how special Darksiders 2 really is. So, was Darksiders 2 as good as I remembered? Of course, I mean, if you didn't guess that by now, I don't know what you've been listening to. Whether it be the story giving further backstory and creating a protagonist in death who is so compelling, the gameplay improvements and changes that work for the better in so many ways and feel like the definitive Darksiders experience. Whatever it may be, in almost every aspect you look at, Darksiders 2 is what any great sequel should be. They definitely mixed up the formula, but not in an alienating way. It still feels like it has the essence of what made the original great, but expands upon and builds on it in ways that only seem to improve it. Yes, eventually I did tap out on Darksiders 2, but that's not because the game was worse. I just am not into that sort of experience for as long, at least, anymore. At the end of the day though, revisiting your favorite game or perceived favorite game in a series isn't always a smash hit. I mean, look at Resistance 2. But Darksiders 2 absolutely lived up to my own expectations and then some. I strongly recommend, if you've never played Darksiders 2, play it. You don't have to play the rest of the series, but you should play Darksiders 2. It's just a great game in its own right, and you see so many videos, or at least I do, about people finally playing it and loving it. It's well worth your time, new or returning player. Go play Darksiders 2. Alright? That's the video. Thank you all so much for watching my Darksiders 2 retrospective. I had so much fun revisiting Darksiders 2, and I hope you enjoyed revisiting the game with me. If you enjoyed the video, make sure to leave it a like because it helps let me know that you enjoyed yourself. Comment below your thoughts on Darksiders 2 or the series in general, as well as any suggestions for games you want to see covered in the future. Shout out to the channel members Ish, FT, Christian and Cloud for that extra level of support. I truly do appreciate it. What's your favorite breakfast food or dish? I actually don't often eat breakfast foods due to years of working night shift and screwing up my body clock, but I will say a good potato hash with some eggs, bacon and hollandaise sauce, that'd have to be my top tier breakfast. Bacon and egg rolls are a close second though. What is an old game you think deserves a full remake? Graphics, gameplay, sound design, etc. That's a tough one because there are so many potential candidates, but one game that does immediately come to mind is the original Infamous. Those graphics have aged terribly, and I'd love to see what they could do with it today. If you're new to the channel, make sure to subscribe, go give my socials a follow if you fancy at MayorHairBear, join the Discord server to have a chat, and I'll catch you all in the next video.